Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korea and the United States appear to be moving one step closer to a landmark shift in their defense and nuclear cooperation. National Security Adviser Wi Sung-lac's visit to Washington last week marked a key moment in follow-up talks on the ROK-US fact sheet, with discussions now pointing toward a separate agreement that could allow Seoul to develop nuclear-powered submarines similar to the deal made with Australia. Now, at the same time, broader agreements on uranium enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing are beginning to take shape under the 123 agreement. With all these in motion, how far have the two sides really come, and what are the strategic implications going forward? For more on this, we connect to Choi Hyun-jin, Professor of Political Science at Kyunghee University. A big welcome, Professor Choi.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
And also joining us is Mason Rishi, a professor of international politics at Hankuk University of Foreign Studies. Good to see you, Professor.
Great, thank you for having me.
So let's begin with Professor Choi, with National Security Adviser Wi Sung-lac's visit to the U.S. last week. He said there had been some progress and follow-up discussions on the fact sheet. So, from your perspective, would you say concrete steps were actually made during this visit?
Thank you for the question. I would not call this Washington visit a decisive advance, but it contributed to moving things forward. So this visit was not about new announcement, but it was about follow-up and also more implementation of the previous agreement. And what is important is that the both countries now agree to talk at the same time on several key issues. And these issues include nuclear power submarine and uranium enrichment and the handling of spent fuel. And also there's another key point, and that was a possible separate agreement between the two countries to allow the transfer of military nuclear material from U.S. to South Korea to help South Korea build a nuclear-powered submarine. And I think this separate agreement would create a clear legal path beyond the existing nuclear agreement between the two countries. So I think now the talks are about how to do it and through which channel, and not just whether it can be done. So simply speaking, the progress is real but practical. And I expect more concrete results will be seen over time as these plans move into action.
So let's get more into the details of this nuclear-powered submarine issue. The two countries reportedly agreed to pursue a separate agreement that would carve out an exception to the Section 91 of the U.S. Atomic Energy Act. For those unfamiliar, Professor Rishi, could you tell us, for our viewers, what exactly is this Section 91, and what could this mean for South Korea's efforts to develop nuclear submarines?
Yeah, sure. So I hope you have a little bit of time because this is kind of complicated, and we're really just scratching the surface. The Atomic Energy Act as a whole is the U.S. legal framework or part of the U.S. legal framework for using atomic energy for peaceful purposes. And most of it actually regulates this domestically in the United States, such as setting up the Atomic Energy Commission. But two sections, at least, there are others, but two sections at the very least are really important for Korea in the context of nuclear powered submarine acquisition. Those two sections are one you've already just referred to, the Section 123, and the other is Section 91. 123 allows the U.S. to cooperate with other countries for civil nuclear purposes, and indeed the U.S. and South Korea already have a 123 agreement in place, which is very strict on non-proliferation criteria, which could be a potential obstacle to South Korea nuclear submarine acquisition and operation. I'll put that aside for a second, come back to it. If the U.S., however, invoked this additional article, the other one you mentioned, Article 91, notably Section 91, subsection C of the Atomic Energy Act, the president under that provision, is allowed to authorize the transfer of nuclear military-related materials and technologies to other countries for military purposes. The president is authorized to do so through the Defense Department, through the Energy Department, and obviously the larger national security and national defense complex in the United States would have to be involved in that as well. Things get a little bit more complicated because there are connections between the sections 123 and section 91 provisions, such that South Korea's 123 agreement would require any Section 91 agreement to contain a long list of safeguards for non-proliferation, which is what the 123 is about. And indeed would ultimately even allow the United States under 91 to abrogate the agreement with South Korea if it violated any of those non-proliferation provisions. Things would get even more complicated if South Korea wants to use indigenously enriched uranium for the submarine reactors. And this would, for reasons I guess I don't have time to get into now, probably require, in my estimation, an amendment to, or at least an addenda to the 123 agreement.
Thank you so much for the clarification, Professor. So in Australia's case, a similar exception was made to Section 91, we're aware. So it could move forward with acquiring nuclear-powered submarines through that. So looking at that precedent, what kind of negotiation strategy should South Korea be preparing for to secure a similar deal, Professor Che?
Okay, the case of Australia showed that the so-called Section 91 is not just a single document. Rather, it combines a legal obligation, the safeguards, and the long-term planning. So we can get some important lessons from Australia. The first one is that we must clearly define the scope. We should clearly state from the very start that the nuclear material would be used only for the propulsion, and our submarine would carry only conventional weapon, not the one with a nuclear warhead. And secondly, the strong non-proliferation and the transparency measures are very important. The United States will focus on how this nuclear fuel used for submarine is supplied, stored, and protected. So Korea would need a credible plan for external fuel supply and also strict accounting and also security, as well as close cooperation with the international safeguard measures based on the IAEA mechanism. So the message must be simple: no diversion and no misuse. And thirdly, the domestic readiness is also important. Australia had to build a new domestic system for safety, regulation, and oversight. So South Korea, just like Australia, would also need to show that we have enough technical and legal and the human capacity to manage this new weapon system responsibly over time. So lessons from Australia can be summarized in one sentence. Our proposal to the United States must be narrow, transparent, and also safe.
So Korea really needs to come up prepared with a detailed, tailored proposal there. So Professor Rishi, if South Korea actually proceeds with its own nuclear-powered submarines, what would be the broader strategic implications for the ROK-U.S. alliance and the regional military balance in Northeast Asia as well?
Well, I'll start with the second half of that question first and deal with the balance of power, notably in the region issue. So in the first place, if South Korea, were to indeed, develop in cooperation with the United States, procure, acquire, and eventually operate a small fleet of nuclear-propelled submarines with conventional munitions, as Professor Che has just pointed out, that would be a real added, real upgraded capability that South Korea would have. It would be joining a very exclusive club. The number of countries that operate nuclear-propelled submarines is very small, and the capability improvements that South Korea would get in that regard are significant. And you know, the significance, how meaningful they are, however, I think is really determined by the countries for whom these submarines are supposed to serve as a deterrent, and if necessary, of course, a platform for warfighting. And in the case that probably one would most likely think, if one's considering North Korea as South Korea's primary adversary, I have some real questions about the strategic value that has, that these submarines have. Notably, the Yellow Sea to the west of South Korea is not really suitable, or it's not really necessary, I think, for submarine-related warfare to have nuclear-powered submarines. Air independent, diesel electric is just fine. The advantages of nuclear powered submarines are, obviously, essentially, infinite duration underwater, really only limited by the ability of the crew to stay underwater, and food and other types of necessities. And speed is, of course, another one. So for traversing very long distances of undersea at speed. And of course, that might make some sense for South Korea in the sea to the east of the Korean Peninsula, where the waters are deeper, the distances are longer. But even for then, I'm not sure that that's necessarily a big deal vis-a-vis North Korea. I think some anti-submarine warfare capabilities to neutralize any potential North Korean threats underwater are probably sufficient. So that, of course, leads you to the question of whether or not these submarines are going to be used vis-a-vis China. And there, of course, that would be a huge strategic advantage for South Korea, for the U.S.-South Korea alliance, for the trilateral cooperation in the military domain with Japan. So that's, I think, one part of the balance there. The second part is, this is, might well feed into a regional arms race, which is already ongoing anyway. So that might end up being a sort of an additional catalyzer there. To the first part of your question about the alliance and how this affects the alliance, in the first place, I think, as I just mentioned, South Korea is now, in some sense, committed to use these submarines to counter China. President Lee more or less had to state that publicly during the bilateral summit just prior to APEC. He's on the record now as the president of South Korea saying that China has taken notice and they're not going to be particularly happy about it. So how that plays out in terms of bringing the alliance closer together, I think, is interesting. But for one thing, I think, as some people might be surprised to really think about, this actually makes South Korea in some ways more dependent on the U.S. Alliance going forward rather than less. Maybe in the long term, South Korea gains its capability in such a way that it could get some additional autonomy from the United States. But over the next, let's say, decade to 15 years, if not longer, I think it's actually more dependent on the alliance rather than less.
So it has a lot to do with impact on the region as well. Now, another note regarding uranium enrichment and spent fuel reprocessing. Wi Sung-lac said that a broad agreement had already been reached and that further steps are now required. So within the framework of the U.S.-Korea 123 agreement, what would both sides be mindful of when negotiating the next steps, Professor Che?
Okay, I think the issue of nuclear, the spent fuel reprocessing and uranium enrichment is much more sensitive than nuclear submarine. So when Advisor Wi Sung-lac says a broad agreement is already in place, I think he's talking about the political understanding at the leadership level between the two presidents. Within the so-called 123 agreement, the real job is now lies in the follow-up procedure. I think the first key consideration, as I emphasized earlier, the peaceful use and non-proliferation. And any discussion on uranium enrichment or spent fuel reprocessing must clearly remain within the civilian and peaceful use. And this is very important, not just for the US administration, but also for American Congress and the international community in general. And secondly, the safeguards and transparency are very important. The future consultation with Washington will require clear rules on monitoring and also material control and the cooperation with the IAEA inspection regime. And finally, the legal consideration as well. The fact sheet between Seoul and Washington is using very careful language. It says like this: the U.S. supports procedure that are consistent with the existing agreement and U.S. law. And this word, the supporting procedure, may sound somewhat cautious and also ambiguous, but it shows the reality that any progress must move step by step within the 1, 2, 3 framework. And in some cases, our consultation may require US congressional review. So in general, we need a steady and realistic approach rather than pushing forward for quick results.
Right, so we are really gearing up to push forward with the follow-up measures following the fact sheet agreement. So, Professor Rishi, from your standpoint, what do you think are the most urgent steps that the Korean government needs to take to effectively implement the items outlined in the fact sheet and ensure this follow-up process gains actual momentum?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Professor Che has been saying in sort of partial answer to this question. The first thing is obviously South Korea has to get its own legal framework in order, right? South Korea doesn't have nuclear-powered submarines. It doesn't use reactors for military purposes. And so this is going to require legal changes that are very significant. And so I have no doubt that South Korea's legal expert community in consultation with the relevant government ministries will be able to do that. And of course, the Lee administration having a functioning majority in the National Assembly, of course, makes it functionally able to do that. But there's quite a bit of work to be done there, and I'm sure South Korea will be benchmarking other countries in this regard. Second, obviously, there's quite a lot of technical work that has to go on. You don't just pluck nuclear-powered submarines out of trees. There's a huge amount of technical work that's going to have to happen. Whether that be reactor design, if that's something that South Korea ends up doing itself. But obviously the weapon systems, the electrical systems, the control surfaces, all the sensoring technologies, all of these things, are technically complex, and I have no doubt that South Korea can do it. But those are things that have to start being, worked on as soon as possible. And of course, that includes the larger engineering and actual construction of the submarines themselves, making sure you have the available workforce, and the available shipyard space, et cetera, et cetera. And that's non-trivial. Third, I think South Korea needs to prepare for cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency on non-proliferation issues. Professor Che talked about the message of South Korea to the United States for nuclear-powered submarines involving, the notion of safety, and that includes both nuclear safety in terms of accidents, but also in terms of non-proliferation safeguards. South Korea has never cooperated with the IAEA in this extremely sensitive military nuclear propulsion domain. So that's something where South Korea is going to have to do some work, not only legally, probably, but also just in terms of getting its culture in the Ministry of Defense and in the national security community and the atomic energy community here around the fact that they're going to have to change some of the way that they do business in order to cooperate transparently with the IAEA. And then lastly, politically, South Korea is going to have to be prepared, to be committed to making sure that the U.S. stays on board on this. As Professor Che just talked about, if, for instance, South Korea were to begin enriching uranium for use in a military reactor, in a nuclear submarine reactor, that, in my estimation, may well require changes to the 1, 2, 3 agreement, either an addenda to it or a modification of it, or even a renegotiation of the agreement. Because the essential point is that the 1, 2, and 3 agreement that the U.S. has with South Korea currently requires that all South Korean enrichment activity that uses any U.S. materials and technology is for civil use, not for military use. And so I think that you would need to possibly have some changes there, and that gets the broader U.S. government involved and possibly even Congress involved in a way that means that you're going to have more potential people in the United States, especially in the non-proliferation community, who have some real, I think, second thoughts about how good of an idea this is from a non-proliferation perspective, and they will have more levers that they can use in order to slow this down. And so the South Koreans are going to have to make sure that they get whatever government in the U.S. is in place at the time to continue to remain focused on moving this project forward.
So a lot of complex and cautious steps we have to look forward to. But before we conclude our discussion tonight, Professor Rishi, there are also growing talk of potential Korea-China and Korea-Japan summits early next year. But how do you see this recent progress with the U.S. possibly linking into Seoul's broader diplomatic strategy in the region?
Sure. So, obviously this added capability, if it comes on board, as I mentioned earlier, really supports the U.S.-South Korea alliance, especially in the trilateral configuration with Japan. But of course, here the understanding from Japan, just like I think in Washington right now, is that these submarines would ultimately be used to deter and counter, and if necessary, be involved in some type of conflict with China, and one would think most likely in the context of some type of Taiwan Strait crisis. And so I think that's a real added advantage for South Korea vis-a-vis both Washington and Tokyo. But of course, the flip side of that, as you mentioned, is China. And China doesn't like this for obvious reasons. And if I were China, I also wouldn't like this. And if I were China, I would try to find a way to deter South Korea from going down this path. I would try to find a way to throw sand in the gears. I would try to do whatever I can to prevent South Korea from acquiring these extremely powerful platforms. And so I think it's going to be very interesting to see whether or not China does do that. If we see some type of reprise of the kind of actions that China took against South Korea in the context of the THAAD battery deployment on the South Korean in South Korea about a decade ago. Or whether or not China feels like it can't do enough about that. Maybe it doesn't feel like it's capable of driving a wedge between Washington and South Korea in this context. And we're going to begin to see, I think, some of the answers to those questions over the next, let's say, 6 months, when presumably President Lee and Xi Jinping will be potentially scheduling a summit, and when we'll see where China comes down on this and how it is that they comport themselves.
Definitely. So we will be able to see whether defense policy and regional diplomacy could interlock in the coming months or so. We'll have to keep close tabs on that. But as for now, thank you so much for your insights, Professor Rishi.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, Professor She, we really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.